It's been 30 years, and we're still talking about the little greasy alien those girls found crouching beside a wall in Varginha, Brazil. Not because everyone agrees on what happened, but because the story never really ended. Unlike so many UFO cases, Varginha continued to grow. New witnesses came forward, doctors began speaking publicly, researchers kept digging, and now, 3 decades later, members of Congress in the United States are asking intelligence agencies whether any records connected to the case itself still exist. So what exactly happened in January of 1996? Let's go back to the beginning. Most people remember the Varginha incident because of the creature. But according to many of the people who have spent years researching the case, the story may have actually begun several days earlier. On January 13, 1996, local farmer Carlos de Souza was driving through the countryside outside Varginha when he noticed something unusual in the sky. He later described seeing a large cigar-shaped object moving slowly overhead. What caught his attention wasn't just its size, but the way it was moving. He said the object appeared to be in distress, trailing smoke as it descended toward the landscape in the distance. If his account had remained an isolated sighting, it probably wouldn't have attracted much attention. Strange things are reported in the sky every year, and most of them quietly fade away. But according to people living in the region, that wasn't the end of the story. Over the next several days, rumors began spreading through nearby communities. Some residents spoke about unusual lights moving through the night sky. Others recalled military vehicles traveling roads that normally saw very little activity. There were also stories of temporary roadblocks and security around certain rural areas, although no one at the time seemed to know exactly what was happening. Looking back today, it's impossible to know which of these reports, if any, were connected. But what's interesting is that many of them were already circulating before the encounter that would make Varginha famous around the world. At that point, nobody was talking about aliens. Nobody was talking about creatures. People were simply trying to make sense of a series of strange events unfolding around them. Then, 1 week later, everything changed. On the afternoon of January 20, 3 young women walking through the city would come face to face with something they say they had never seen before. And from that moment on, the Varginha incident would become much bigger than a single sighting. By the afternoon of January 20, 1996, the strange reports that had been circulating around Varginha for nearly a week took a dramatic turn. 3 young women, Lilian Silva, Valkyria Silva, and Katia Javier, were walking home through a neighborhood in Varginha when they decided to cut through a vacant lot. It was an ordinary shortcut, one they had taken before, and there was no reason to believe that day would be any different. Then they saw it. Crouched beside a wall was a small creature unlike anything they had ever encountered. For the rest of their lives, they would remember its appearance in remarkable detail. They described it as something around 4 feet tall with a disproportionately large head, enormous red eyes, and dark brown skin that looked wet, almost oily. That description of its skin would become one of the defining characteristics of the Varginha case, earning it a nickname that many UFO enthusiasts still use today, the Little Greasy Alien. What struck them, just as much as its appearance, was the expression on its face. The creature didn't appear to be attacking anyone. It didn't chase them. According to their accounts, it looked frightened, weak, and almost as though it were injured or exhausted. Some researchers have even suggested it may have been trying to hide. Whatever it was, the encounter terrified the young women. They ran from the vacant lot and told their families what they had seen. As often happens in small communities, news spread quickly. Within hours, neighbors were talking. Friends were comparing stories. People began gathering near the area where the creature had been seen, hoping to catch a glimpse of it for themselves. By itself, that might have been where the story ended. 3 frightened witnesses, 1 strange encounter, a mystery that slowly faded into local folklore. Instead, the story became even stranger, because as word spread through the city, something else began drawing people's attention: the military. Residents started noticing military vehicles moving through different parts of Varginha. Soldiers were seen searching areas where the creature had reportedly been spotted, and before long, stories began circulating that one or more beings had actually been captured. Whether those stories all describe the same event or several different events unfolding at once has been debated ever since. What isn't debated is that from this point forward, the Varginha incident was no longer just about what three young women claimed to have seen. It had become a story about what happened next, who responded, what was recovered, and where it was taken. Those questions would shape the Varginha mystery for the next 30 years. Every famous UFO case seems to have a moment when the mystery changes. People stop asking what was seen and start asking who showed up afterward. For Varginha, the moment came almost immediately. As word spread about the strange creature, residents throughout the city began noticing something that, according to many witnesses, felt out of the ordinary. Military vehicles were seen moving through different neighborhoods. Soldiers appeared in areas where the creature had reportedly been spotted, and stories began circulating that authorities were actively searching for something. At first, no one knew exactly what was happening. Some believed the military had been called in simply to investigate the growing rumors. Others were convinced they were responding to something much more specific. As more people came forward, the story became increasingly detailed. Some witnesses described seeing military trucks transporting large containers through the city. Others claim they watched soldiers secure locations before allowing anyone else near them. There were also accounts suggesting that more than one creature had been recovered, although the exact number has remained one of the many points of disagreement surrounding the case. Like many enduring mysteries, the Varginha incident isn't built on a single account. It's built on dozens of accounts. Some overlap, some contradict one another, but together, they paint a picture that has fascinated researchers for decades. As investigators continued speaking with witnesses over the years, another pattern began to emerge. Different people who didn't know each other often described the military response in surprisingly similar ways. They recalled the urgency, the movement of vehicles, the restricted areas, the feeling that something significant was happening just out of public view. Whether those similarities point to a genuine recovery operation or simply reflect how stories evolve within a community has been debated ever since. But one thing is difficult to ignore. Once the military became involved, the conversation changed. People were no longer asking only about the creature. They were asking where it had gone, who had taken it, and perhaps most importantly, why. That question would lead investigators toward one of the most talked about figures in the entire Varginha case, a young military officer named Marco Eli Chereze. If you've spent any time researching the Varginha incident, you've almost certainly come across the name Marco Eli Chereze. Among all the military personnel connected to the case, his story has become one of the most discussed, and for many, one of the most emotional. According to numerous accounts, Chereze was one of the officers involved in recovering the creature after it had been located. Witnesses say he came into direct physical contact with the being while helping move it into a military vehicle before it was transported away. Whether that happened exactly as described remains one of the central questions surrounding the case. What happened afterward, however, is what ensured his name would remain part of the story. Not long after the alleged recovery, Chereze became seriously ill. He developed a severe infection that progressed rapidly despite medical treatment. His condition continued to worsen and he eventually died. For many people following the case, those events became impossible to separate. The officer who allegedly handled the creature had died only weeks later. Supporters of the Varginha story have long viewed that sequence of events as one of the case's most compelling details. Others argue that his illness can be explained without connecting it to an extraordinary encounter. Either way, Chereze's death gave the Varginha incident something few UFO cases ever acquire: a deeply personal human story. Until then, the mystery had revolved around an unknown creature. Now, it also revolved around a young officer whose life ended far too soon. And according to those investigating the case, the story wasn't over yet, because if the creature had truly been transported away, where had it been taken? For many researchers, all roads eventually led to one place: the hospital. 4 minutes. Dr. Italo Venturelli had spent much of his professional life as a neurosurgeon at the regional hospital in Varginha. For decades, his name rarely surfaced in public discussions about the incident. Then, during renewed interest surrounding the 30th anniversary, he stepped forward with an account that immediately caught the attention of researchers around the world. According to Dr. Venturelli, he was brought into a secure area of the hospital, where a strange being had been taken following its recovery. He says he spent approximately 4 minutes examining the creature. 4 minutes. It's remarkable how much significance can be attached to such a short amount of time. According to his description, the being was unlike anything he had encountered during his medical career. It appeared weak but alive. It wasn't behaving like a frightened animal, nor did it resemble any known medical condition he had ever treated. What stayed with him most, he later explained, wasn't simply the creature's appearance. It was the encounter itself. For decades, that memory remained with him. Then, 30 years after the events of January 1996, he chose to speak publicly. Whether people ultimately accept his testimony or not, its importance is difficult to overlook. Very few UFO cases continue adding new first-hand accounts after 3 decades. Most grow quieter with time. Varginha has done the opposite. Its story has continued to evolve. And that evolution is one of the reasons filmmaker James Fox believed it was time to bring the case back into the public spotlight. For many UFO cases, time has a way of closing the book. Witnesses pass away, documents disappear into archives, locations change. Eventually, the story becomes something people remember rather than something they continue investigating. The Varginha incident followed a very different path. As the years passed, researchers continued interviewing witnesses, collecting photographs, comparing testimony, and revisiting the locations connected to the case. Every now and then, a new interview would surface or another piece of the puzzle would emerge, reminding people that Varginha still had unanswered questions. Then, as the 30th anniversary approached, filmmaker James Fox decided it was time to bring the case back into the spotlight. If you've followed James Fox's work over the years, you'll know that he has spent much of his career documenting some of the most well-known UFO cases in the world. The Varginha incident has long been one of the investigations closest to him, and after years of interviewing witnesses and gathering material, he believed the story deserved another opportunity to be heard. But this wasn't simply about releasing another documentary. It was about taking the conversation somewhere it had never gone before: Washington, D.C. In 2026, 30 years after the events in Brazil, James Fox stood alongside researchers, witnesses, and members of Congress to present the Varginha case to a new audience. Among those lending their support was Representative Eric Burleson, one of several lawmakers who has taken an active interest in unidentified anomalous phenomena and government transparency. That alone marked a significant moment in the history of the case. For 3 decades, Varginha had largely existed within books, documentaries, conferences, and conversations inside the UFO community. Now, it was being discussed just miles from the halls of American government. The goal wasn't simply to revisit old stories, it was to ask whether any government agencies still possessed information that had never been made public. As part of that effort, formal requests were submitted asking the CIA and the FBI to search for and release any records connected to the Varginha incident. Whether those agencies ultimately have anything related to the case remains an open question, but the requests themselves represented something new. The investigation was no longer being carried solely by independent researchers. It had reached the attention of elected officials. One of the more overlooked aspects of the Washington briefing involved the people who never made it to the stage. Several Brazilian witnesses who had been expected to participate were unable to obtain visas allowing them to travel to the United States. For James Fox, that was undoubtedly frustrating. After spending years encouraging witnesses to come forward, some of the very people whose experiences helped shape the Varginha's story were prevented from sharing their accounts in person during one of the case's most important public events. Even so, their voices remained part of the investigation. Their interviews had already been recorded. Their stories had already become part of the historical record, and through those recordings, they were still able to contribute to a conversation that had begun 3 decades earlier in a quiet Brazilian city. One thing I find fascinating about the Varginha incident is how resistant it has been to becoming just another historical UFO case. Most famous sightings eventually settle into familiar territory. People choose a side, books are written, the debate slowly loses momentum. Varginha has never really done that. Instead, every few years, something happens that pulls the case back into the public conversation. A new witness speaks, a researcher uncovers another interview, a documentary introduces the story to a new audience, or, as we've seen this year, lawmakers begin asking whether governments still have records connected to what happened. That doesn't answer the mystery. If anything, it reminds us how much of this story feels unfinished. 30 years later, people are still asking the same questions. What exactly happened in Varginha? Who or what did the military recover? And if answers do exist somewhere, will they ever become public? Those questions have kept the Varginha incident alive for 3 decades, but I don't think that's the only reason this story has endured, because when you step back and look at the case as a whole, it begins to reveal something much bigger than a single event in Brazil. It begins to tell us something about the nature of ufology itself. After spending the last 30 years examining one of the most fascinating UFO cases in modern history, it's worth asking a simple question. Why are we still talking about Varginha? There are thousands of UFO reports from around the world every single year. Most disappear almost as quickly as they arrive. A few make headlines for a while before fading into history. Very few remain part of the conversation for decades. Varginha is one of those rare exceptions, and I don't think that's because of any one piece of evidence. I think it's because the story has continued to evolve. One thing I've always found interesting about ufology is how easily our attention becomes centered on the United States. Roswell, Area 51, the Phoenix Lights, the Tic Tac encounters. Those are all important cases, but they sometimes make us forget that people around the world have been reporting extraordinary experiences for generations. Every country brings its own culture, its own history, its own traditions, and those things influence the way people interpret encounters they struggle to explain. A strange being seen in one part of the world might immediately be described as an extraterrestrial. Somewhere else, that same encounter might be understood through the lens of local folklore, religion, or stories that have been passed down for centuries. That doesn't necessarily make one interpretation more valid than another. It reminds us that our understanding of the unknown is often shaped by the culture we grow up in. I also think Varginha has something that many famous UFO cases simply don't. It still has living voices. 30 years later, researchers can still sit down with people who say they were there. They can revisit the streets where the sightings took place. They can interview doctors. They can speak with investigators. And they can continue asking questions that still haven't been fully answered. Unlike Roswell, which now depends heavily on historical documents and memories passed down through generations, Varginha still feels alive. The story isn't locked away in history books, it's still unfolding. Maybe that's why the little greasy alien from Varginha has never really gone away. Whether you see this as one of the most compelling UFO cases ever documented, a remarkable misunderstanding that grew into modern folklore, or something that falls somewhere in between, the story has endured because people continue returning to it. Not to prove a point, but to ask questions. 30 years later, the mystery is still alive, and perhaps that's the most remarkable part of the Varginha incident. Not that it happened, but that we're still trying to understand it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this investigation, consider liking and subscribing because there are plenty more mysteries waiting for us. I'll see you guys in the next one.